Okay, so welcome to this paper in the Classical Association seminar series 2021. And what a pleasure to welcome Dr. Ian Goh from Swansea University, where he's a good friend of Manchester Classics. And he's currently is a lecturer in classics at Swansea University in the Department of Classics, Ancient History and Egyptology. He's a Latin literature specialist, and he works on Roman culture and literature in many forms. His PhD and subsequent publications are around Lucilius and the archaeology of Roman satire. And he's currently working on lots of different projects, the most striking of which the title is Ancient Vomit, a cultural history of Greek and Roman emesis. And I'm hoping very much that we don't talk about that much today, because what we're going to talk about is Roman food and recipes and food culture. So I'll hand directly over to you, Ian.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, April. Let me share my screen without further ado, so that we can get this show on the road. I have, let me find the slideshow. Move that bar. No, don't do that. And start the slideshow. Well, I could do that. Right. Yes. I'm delighted to be here, even if it's not in person. Still, it is, I hope, going to be a convivial setting. I plan to talk for about half an hour. I have some comments about 3 different sets of passages, and then I hope that we'll have some spirited discussion, and I will make some of these pesto recipes, essentially, which is my topic today. So, let's get going. The ancient recipe Moratum is a mixture of ingredients which represents a kind of cucina povera, peasant cookery, in 3 literary texts. That's what I'm talking about today. Firstly, briefly, in Ovid's calendrical archaeological poem about Roman festivals, the Fasti, written in elegiacs like Callimachus's Itia. Second, the Moratum, a 122-line poem in hexameters, which is, of course, the meter of epic, didactic, and satire. That poem has come down to us in the Appendix Virgiliana, although it is unlikely to have been written by Virgil and was probably composed under the reign of Tiberius. Lastly, I'm going to talk about the end of the final book, 12, of Columella's ancient Escape to the Country, a farming manual, De Re Rustica. My interest in linking these 3 texts' Moratum recipes originally had to do with food and function. They are, surprisingly, hardly ever analysed or even cited together, these 3. And if so, purely from a practical standpoint, often in cookery blogs or books who, a bit like I'm planning to do in about half an hour, attempt to recreate the authentic Roman recipe and therefore recapture something of the ancient food culture. The Hexameter poem has attracted particular attention because it seems additionally to provide unusual evidence of what the labouring class, which is to say the rural poor and probably servile, ate, and controversially also how they apparently behaved. While excellent work is being done right now on this precise topic by Francesca Bellet and Tom Goy, my comments here will be more concerned with connections, and I won't say intertextuality because it doesn't really amount to that, but connections between the 3 texts. And my concern is also with the choices that are made, which speak to their respective authors' arrangement and self-presentation. That is to say that my reading of the passages, these texts, is not explicitly political, because at the same time, politics, polemic, choices in these texts, identity, these are questions that are central to the world of food, even or especially in literature of this kind. And the way it manifests for me, this politics, is bound up in the symbolism of the food, the way it's described and its placement in the text, which is an interesting kind of work for such a humble subject and such explicitly humble texts to attempt to perform. So that by way of introduction. Now, first I want to talk about the Fastimaratum. This is described, this passage, at the end of the poet's questioning of the muse, as is typical of this text, which proceeds to a large extent through Ovid interviewing gods. In this case, he has been interviewing a muse about the cult of the Magna Mater, the great mother of the gods, as you can see here, on the occasion of the Megalensia, her festival of 4th April. And this interrogation comes near the end of the segment, and it's preceded by a long narrative of the procession in the goddess's honor, which continues into etiologies, that is to say, explanations of the reasons for aspects of her cult, and then the occasion of her cult image's journey to Rome in the very late 200s BC. Now, this simple offering, the herb salad, so-called, the Moratum, is described as and explained in this passage. Ovid asks, is it not shameful to have placed this Moratum on the mistresses, on the gods' tables? Or is there a particular reason behind it? Of course there's a reason. The muse says, the men of old are said to have lived on pure milk and whatever herbs the earth produced of its own accord. White cheese is mixed with pounded herbs so that an ancient goddess may recognize ancient food. Now, this simple offering stands in contrast to a description about 20 lines earlier of elite food. There are feasts that happen at the Megalensia, and these are so-called mutationes. They're kind of changing places, and they celebrate, apparently, the god's change of residence from Asia Minor to become assimilated by Rome. And there is a prominent wordplay in that account that Ovid gives about 20 lines earlier on the word mutare, on changing. Okay? So there is rhetoric of changing to do with the elites, and here in this passage, unchanging, it remained the same. The impression we get, I think, from this is that Ovid is covering all bases. He's being completist, and he's bringing his questioning to a close with the small stuff, with the humble details. This passage also, I would say, can be read as a piece of Ovidian archaizing, and more than that, of sleight of hand. What Ovid is doing here is quite similar to something he does about 20 lines later, where he uses the word panis, bread. This is in his account of the Cerealia of the Festival of Ceres now. And that word would have been a shock to Ovid's audience because the word panis does not get used in high-flown literature. Ovid's audience would have expected a more elevated paraphrase such as the gifts of Ceres, Cereris dona. And these two early meals, these ancient meals like bread, what could be more ancient than bread and which you eat with this herb salad, these two early meals are participating in a piece of assimilation. Just as the Magna Mater was welcomed at Rome, Ovid is quietly making the early meal offerings to the Magna Mater Roman. This is a subtle act of imperialism. And this point comes from Molly Pascoe Pranger. He's integrating the much more modern Megalensia festival into the older agricultural festivals like the Cerealia. Those are the ones that traditionally dominated April, and they succeed this new festival, the Megalensia, calendrically. And what he does, Ovid, is to make his Magna Mater not an agricultural goddess, unlike Varro had done, because Varro had previously assimilated the Magna Mater to Ceres, whose festival comes right after it. Rather, Ovid's Magna Mater is urban and socializing. And there is a question here as to how patrician exactly she would have been, as opposed to Ceres, who had long been held to be plebeian. Okay, so all of these paradoxes in tandem kind of inform the close of Ovid's account of the Megalensia in this Moratum. And I want to focus also in this discussion on the word elisi, here meaning pounded or crushed. And it comes from elidere. And Elaine Fantham in her commentary calls this choice of word, which you can see in the second last line here, rather drastic. And it is an unusual choice because it only appears here in the Fasti or in all of Ovid's other elegiac poetry. Now, if we think of other meanings of elidere, namely to shake out or to eliminate, especially a disease, I would advance the idea that Ovid is signaling with this word both the civilizing impulse and his own agency in crafting this portrayal of the goddess, in removing some bits, in shaking out some bits that don't fit. And I'm going to return to this point a bit later in the discussion of these texts. As we leave the Fasti version, I just also want to say, notice that the cheese, this white cheese, dominates. Okay? And that the color of the cheese is described. Now let's move on to the Hexameter Moratum poem. Now this poem tracks the work and life of a man named Simulus, who has a small fenced-in plot, a garden, you might say, and he also has a wealthy neighbor, and he has an African, explicitly African slave named Cybele, spelled S-C-Y-B-A-L-E. All of this rings alarm bells as to his agency, his status, and his relationship to the poet who describes all these things. Simulus sells produce at the market, but eats cheaply. And the poet gives an aside just before the passage with the recipe on the next, on this slide and the next couple. The poet says, who could be contractior, more contracted than him? Right? He's small in stature, bent down by hard work, we're meant to think, and he doesn't eat very much. The advertisement then is for shrinkage, and this shrinkage occasioned by his life matches the circumscription of this poem, of this trivial or small poem, with its apparently trivial subject. But it's also something that stands in contrast to the easy growing of the cheap vegetables that are here listed, and also in contrast to the phallic potency of the aphrodisiac rocket, which you see in the third line here. Yet, of course, Simulus, whose name means snub-nosed, so he's a kind of parody of high culture. He is himself a poet. And that's because at the point here, which is marked by ring composition, where the garden digression, the description of the vegetables he grows in his garden, and that ends, and he enters that same garden here, it was with some such menu in mind that he went into his garden. This point of ring composition involves him planning some such menu. What has been mentioned so far here that is in his garden that he might eat are red onion, chives, watercress, endive, and rocket. All of these are sharp tasting vegetables. What goes into his Moratum, by contrast, are Okay, lots of garlic. Parsley, though, not quite so sharp. Rue, very bitter. And then coriander, less sharp. So, and all of these vegetables are available in winter. But he went in pondering one thing, and he comes back with another. In the same way that prior to this passage, he had taken rich men's produce, like cucumbers, for instance, to market, and he'd come back with money. And also, in the actual Moratum that he's going to make, the rue is an anti-aphrodisiac, so it balances out the earlier rocket. So I would say that the creation of the Moratum here is an unexpected swerve. Yeah? And this has not really been taken account of in the scholarship. Scholarly attention has really been sidetracked by the frequent observation that there's just so much garlic here, 4 heads of garlic. There are also notices, there are also notes on the reminiscences of Tityrus in Virgil's Eclogue 1, in how he's having such menu in mind. He's meditans, he's meditating in the same way that Tityrus had meditated the rustic muse. The high garlic content and its potential for creating dragon breath do mark a difference from the seemingly more refined versions of the Moratum absolutely everywhere else. Right? So for instance, there is a Moratum recipe in Apicius's cookbook, which includes a lot of vegetables, but no garlic. And in Columella, who we're going to see in a few minutes, again, no garlic. So that's been a touchstone for criticism of this passage, with Horace's Epode 3 in the back of the mind, because that's a poem about the evilness of garlic. Horace calling out his patron Maecenas for giving him bad luck with the girls by encouraging him to eat garlic. It's also a given to observe at this juncture that this poem has actually given rise to something quite important in popular culture, or in the reception of classics. And that is because this poem gives rise to the words on the Great Seal of the United States, A pluribus unum, which you see here, where it says, one color emerged from several, color est a pluribus unus. Now, as William Fitzgerald has cannily noted on 2 separate occasions with relation to 2 separate things, there are 2 missing words in the Great Seal. One of these is color. Yeah? And it is ironic, of course, that it is color that has created so much grief and in racial tension for America. Also, something that is missing is the word in the next line, variato, which carries an implication, variegated, of diversity, you might say, of simultaneous unwholeness in a lack of uniformity. And now this is why I drew your attention, I hope you see, to the white cheese earlier, because here the careful delineation of the color of this thing is different from that white cheese-driven Moratum in the Fasti. And it's also different to the Simulus's slave, Cybele, whose name means dung, and who is explicitly described as black fusca colore earlier on in the poem. So perhaps there is a point being made with the careful description of the color of the Moratum, with reference both to what has happened earlier in the poem, which is not very clear on what color Simulus is, if for instance he has a farmer's tan, and what it's doing together with the kind of the underclass of the underclass in this poem, and which is very inexplicit about the actual relationship between Simulus and Cybele. In light of these details, I want to bypass the comments on the strong stench of the mixture, which follow soon after. So often the sharp smell went right up the man's spreading nostrils, so he smells the garlic. The big deal, as I've said in the scholarship of this poem, is how much garlic there is and what it makes him feel. Because this seems paradoxical. The smell he doesn't like, his eyes are streaming, he curses the reek, and yet he is eager to eat the finished product. William Fitzgerald goes on to note the regularity of Simulus's mortar-pestle motion being like the hexameter of this poem which it's in. He says, the poem says, the more heavily the pestle travelled in slow circles, it goes back and forth, just like the lines of poetry here. And of course, this is all to do with this paradoxical idea that it's quite a sophisticated poem describing something relatively unsophisticated. Emily Gowers has talked about the roundness of the finished product here being its own little universe. Here, the parts are brought into a single ball so as to produce Moratum, which matches the way it looks and also its name. It's perfect in appearance as in name, as Ted Kenny's translation has it. But what I want to concentrate here for a couple of minutes is to do with what the poet might mean with two fingers. You see in the fourth last line here, finally with two fingers he wiped around the whole mortar and brought together the parts into a single ball. Now, the late Ted Kenny's long note here at this juncture is right to say that two hands for shaping the ball of cheese, essentially. It's kind of a cheese. I've called it a cheese dip in the abstract, but it's more like something you kind of mold into an arancino or something. I don't know, before you fry it. And Kenny says that two hands for shaping the ball would be more logical, but to make fingers metonymy for hands is unparalleled and therefore unlikely. Also, the rationale he ends up giving of alliteration, duobus digitis, it's a bit of a cop-out. So I have two proposals here. I would ask, firstly, if you like, there I think could be an obscene meaning, which is possible in a kind of farmer wants a wife, love in the countryside way. And we also need to ask whether it is two fingers on one hand or one finger on each hand. Because I think that this is a reference to tasting as you go. One obviously would not sample with one's entire hand. And also you can't really write with your entire hand. You see what I mean? You would use one finger to write. In this case then, the old question of fidelity to realism and for what audience is this being written, this reappears. With this idea I have of the chef kind of tasting it to see how sharp it is and seeing how much seasoning he might want to add. This can then be coupled to the identification between Simulus and the poetic narrator. Okay, so that's what I wanted to draw your attention to with regard to the hexameter Moratum. Now, let's turn to the Moratum recipes of Columella Book 12. Now, as you can see from this slide, a lot more leeway is being offered here. So, recipe 1, you put into a mortar savory mint, rue, same as in the Moratum, in the poem, coriander, the same, parsley, then leeks or green onion if you don't have leeks, and then leaves of lettuce and rocket, right? Which was only rocket was the example of the menu not chosen before. And then green thyme or calamine, and also pennyroyal, and fresh and salted cheese. And you pound them all together and mix vinegar with them. When you have put this mixture in a bowl, pour oil over it. When you have crushed the green stuff, then you rub walnuts into them, mix in more vinegar and pour oil on top. And then crush up some toasted sesame seeds with more vinegar, and then pour more oil on top. So lots of oil, lots of vinegar, and kind of a bit of everything. Then we have another alternative. Cut Gallic cheese, or actually any other sort you like, in minute pieces and pound it up. Take pine nuts if you've got them, or toast or hazelnuts, or almonds. Add vinegar and oil. If there are no green seasonings, crush dry pennyroyal or thyme or marjoram, dried savory with the cheese, add peppered vinegar and oil. Any one of these herbs, when dry, can also be mixed with cheese if you've got nothing else available. So you see, substitutions galore, which implies ready availability of all these alternatives, and that you'd want to eat it more than once. Right? That you would want to make this a kind of weeknight staple, so to speak. I think in this case, Andre, commenting on this passage, who seems to suggest that it's the liquids that differ between recipes, I don't think he's right to say that, because vinegar and oil, or I think he's saying it for a particular reason, which we will come to, but it would seem from these Moretum recipes that that's wrong. All of them seem to involve oil and vinegar in differing amounts. Yeah? And in fact, in the Moratum beforehand, we had olive oil and vinegar. Okay. Now, I want to turn away from these particular recipes slightly, because we need to ask, who is this information being directed at? Who needs to know? Now, the final book of Columella's treatise about farming, about the rustic life, De Re Rustica, is concerned with a person who is called the Willica. And the Willica, as Ulrika Roth has convincingly argued, was the female counterpart of a Willicus. And a Willicus is often translated as a bailiff in a professional capacity. Now, Columella begins book 12 with a long excursus talking about how the Willicus and a Willica are a pair. And they are apparently married. But weirdly enough, this all kind of rapidly falls apart as he's explaining it, because he derives his information from Xenophon's Oikonomicus, which does not describe the bailiff and bailiff's wife, to use the inaccurate terms, as married, as a married pair. And we need to stress with Roth that these are professional seeming occupations. These are professional occupations, and they are occupied with different spheres. And what might those spheres be? Now, John Henderson has noted that this book is arranged systematically following the course of the year, which is a reminiscence of the methodical approach of the Fasti. And book 12 of Columella is mostly concerned, it turns out, with activities indoors, because, and this will bring me to my point about placement and scope, because these Moratum recipes, which you see on this slide, appear after pages and pages and pages of advice about pickling, which takes up almost the whole book. Pickling of all sorts. And these Moretum recipes, right, which are not pickles, right, they are followed in very quick succession with a short chapter on what are called quick digestives, oxypora. And these two recipes, which follow the two semi-recipes that we had for Moretum, are the ones that involve different ingredients, different liquid ingredients, which I was referring to in Andre's estimation before. So you see, he says here, you mix these digestives with honey, and to use them, you dilute with vinegar and fish sauce, no oil. The second one involves mixing with honey, just with honey and preserving, or more expensively, to mix with all the ingredients from part one. And then, so firstly, a point here is that expense is a question here. You might be buying these ingredients, not producing them yourself. Okay, and in particular, because of silphium, this famously expensive root, which is now all but extinct. And I did read the other day that they found some growing well. And he says also asafoetida can replace silphium if you don't have silphium. So again, with the alternatives, but here with the question of buying things as opposed to producing them yourself. Now, you might ask, what happens next? It turns out that that is the end of the book. This, on this slide, immediately following the quick digestives, is Columella's conclusion. And so, I want to finish here by suggesting two things about these Moretum and quick digestives. We might think about the Moretum as having medical force, or at least some kind of folk remedy force, because they are surrounded by these pickling recipes and then the quick digestive recipes. Many of the pickling recipes also had medical applications. For instance, for internal complaints, omnia intestina vitia, that was in the case of horehound wine, or immediately after that, for promoting digestion, invigorating the body, also for a cough of long standing, and for the stomach. And of course, it's an article of faith that pickles are good for digestion. That second example was in the case of squill wine. Now, for what it's worth, Horace in Satire 2:4 had seemed to hold to the idea that lettuce can, because it floats on wine in the stomach, apparently, revive a flagging drinker, although lettuce was actually one of the foods which Simulus had taken to market and didn't himself eat. Now, I'm reminded here, perhaps because the very first element of these Moretum recipes is Italian savory here, saturea, which had been much remarked upon by Columella in his book 8, in conjunction with beekeeping and with honey. And saturea obviously recalls with its name that most Italian of genres, Roman satire, and the idea of having had enough. Now, it's getting on time for me to end the talking part of this presentation and move on to the practical aspects. So my other point has to do with the game that Columella seems to be playing in his closing advice to Silvanus, the work's addressee. Now, Silvanus's name, of course, means woodsman, and we don't really know whether this is loving the woods or being a bit like wood, the raw material, so he's the perfect didactic addressee. Now, Columella is clear that he has only set down what is most essential in this treatise. You see here, he says, I've never doubted that the number of subjects which might have found a place in the material of my treatise is almost infinite, but I have deemed it proper to set forth only such things as seemed most essential. This summing up strategy, Thorsten Fergen has called, quote, formulated as a user's guide, a Benutzerhinweis, for the reader. But that begs the question, are these Moretum truly essential? And what does that even mean in the context of another salient fact? Columella has actually tried to end his treatise twice before. Once at the end of his poem on gardens, which comprised his book 10. That was a meaningful climax to the first part of his entire work. it rivaled Virgil's Georgics explicitly. And then at the end of book 11, Columella even promises an index to everything that had preceded, an index which of course has not survived, but which is as firm a marker of closure as you could hope for. So I think that after you've exhausted such strategies, perhaps for the successful end of his work, De Re Rustica, Columella felt compelled to reach for a more humble, but if we believe the hexameter poem, somehow singular globe as a symbol of his work's completion. And with that, that also concludes my comments today. Thank you so much for listening and bearing with me.
Thank you, Ian. That was wonderful. Thank you. Wonderfully rich paper. I wonder then if we might move to see more of Ian's kitchen at this point.
Right. All right, let's do this. Should I try the mortar and pestle method?
Yes, please.
Right. I've got some coriander, parsley, and well, fenugreek now. Chopped up, and this could take a while. I fear. I'll do is I'll simply open this ricotta I've got, and that'll make it easier. Hard cheese, some pecorino, and some ricotta.
I hope everyone's writing this down in case they haven't got their colleagues.
Sure. As I said, these are very forgiving recipes. You can't see it because it's not in shot, but Frank is very eager. Right. Some oil in. So oil. I thought might as well. You can kind of see. Mm-hmm. You can also kind of see a very eager dog.
Licking his lips there.
Her lips. Oh. Also has a leaf in her mouth. Hi.
While Ian's doing this, I'll remind you that if you look at the Swansea Classics YouTube channel, there are quite a few videos of Ian doing Roman cookery with all kinds of ingredients and talking about them. So I think that's on the Swansea YouTube page. Is that right, Ian?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
It is.
So we'll put a link to that on the on our YouTube.
Right, because I had the presence of mind to chop these up beforehand, what I will do is I will turn these out into a bowl. Pine nuts. Where are they?
I feel like you should have some music in the background when you're doing this, Ian.
A Suki twist, perhaps, from Brian Laurie.
Yeah.
Or what was that show? Posh Nosh.
Ah, yes, yeah.
Right. I mean, as you can see, I'm just bruising all of this. I fear.
Do you have any idea how this was eaten once it was eaten?
On bread.
Just on bread, right?
Yes, on flat bread, which was easy to make.
Right.
The easier the better. And in another part of the Moratum poem, he's talking. The poet is describing the baking of the loaf.
I see. Yes.
So it would have been eaten probably with hands and on bread of this nature.
That sounds very nice.
And I'm just going to turn it out.
It strikes me that if this is warm, this bread is warm, it's going to be the first ever instance of garlic bread. And as Peter Kay said, that's never going to catch on.
Indeed. Yeah, so should I add vinegar? I'll add some vinegar and red wine vinegar. Yes. And some more oil. And Bob is your uncle. And that is that. Not very.